It was a rainy Tuesday in downtown Chicago. Elijah Brooks, a 38-year-old architect, had just wrapped up a client meeting and stopped by his favorite cafe for a quick bite. He ordered his usual, grilled salmon, quinoa salad, and chamomile tea, but barely touched the food. His mind was elsewhere. As he stepped outside, balancing his umbrella and takeout box, he noticed a man sitting on the curb. Soaked, shivering, and wrapped in a tattered coat, the man looked up with tired eyes. Elijah hesitated. He wasn't the type to ignore suffering, but he also wasn't the type to engage. Something about the man's face tugged at him, a flicker of recognition, buried deep. Without a word, Elijah walked over and handed him the box. "It's still warm," he said. The man took it slowly, nodding in gratitude. Then he looked up and said something that stopped Elijah cold. "You've always been kind. Even when you didn't know it." Elijah froze. "Do I know you?" The man smiled faintly. "You did. A long time ago." Elijah couldn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment, the city lights flickering through the rain-streaked windows, replaying the homeless man's words over and over. "You've always been kind. Even when you didn't know it." He opened an old box tucked beneath his bookshelf, filled with childhood photos, report cards, and a faded yearbook from Lincoln Elementary. As he flipped through the pages, a name caught his eye. Mr. Harold Bennett, 5th grade teacher. Elijah's breath caught. The man on the curb had the same eyes. The same quiet smile. Could it really be him? Memories flooded back. Mr. Bennett had been the only teacher who noticed when Elijah stopped talking after his father died. He had pulled him aside, given him books to read, encouraged him to draw buildings when words failed. One day, Elijah had skipped school and wandered into a construction site. A beam had collapsed, and Mr. Bennett, who had followed him, pulled him out just in time. No one else knew. Elijah had forgotten. Or maybe buried it. Now, decades later, the man who once saved his life was sitting alone in the rain, eating leftovers. Elijah stared at the yearbook photo, heart pounding. "I owe him everything," he whispered. The next morning, Elijah returned to the cafe. He didn't expect to see the man again, but there he was, sitting in the same spot, sipping from a paper cup someone had left behind. Elijah approached slowly. "Mr. Bennett?" he asked. The man looked up, eyes clearer than before. "You remembered." Elijah sat beside him on the curb. "I wasn't sure. But I found my old yearbook. I saw your photo." Mr. Bennett nodded. "I've had better years." They talked for nearly an hour. Elijah learned that Mr. Bennett had retired early due to illness, lost his home after medical bills piled up, and had no family left. He'd been living in shelters, sometimes on the street, for nearly 6 years. Elijah was stunned. How could someone who had given so much end up with so little? "You saved my life once," Elijah said quietly. "I never thanked you." Mr. Bennett smiled. "You became something good. That's thanks enough." But Elijah didn't agree. He couldn't walk away again. He offered to buy him lunch. Mr. Bennett declined at first, but Elijah insisted. They sat inside the cafe, drawing curious glances. Elijah ordered 2 meals and watched as Mr. Bennett ate slowly, savoring every bite. "You always like salmon," Mr. Bennett said with a grin. Elijah laughed. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about my students. Especially the ones who needed someone." That evening, Elijah sat in his office, staring at the photo of Mr. Bennett in his yearbook. He opened his laptop and began searching. Articles, school archives, retirement notices, anything that could confirm the man's identity. Then he found it. A local newspaper article from 12 years ago. "Beloved teacher Harold Bennett retires after 30 years of service." The photo was unmistakable. Same eyes. Same smile. But the article mentioned something Elijah hadn't known. Mr. Bennett was awarded the City Hero Medal in 1997 for saving a student from a construction accident. Elijah's heart raced. That student was him. He had never known. Mr. Bennet had never told anyone. No ceremony. No credit. Just quiet courage. Elijah leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. He saved me. And never asked for anything. He printed the article and placed it beside the yearbook. Then he called his assistant. Cancel tomorrow's meetings. I need to find someone. The next morning, Elijah returned to the cafe. Mr. Bennet wasn't there. He checked nearby shelters. No luck. He walked the streets for hours, asking anyone who might have seen him. Finally, at a small library downtown, a volunteer said, "You mean Harold? He comes here sometimes. Reads old poetry books." Elijah waited. And waited. At 4:17 p.m., Mr. Bennet walked in, carrying a plastic bag and wearing the same tattered coat. Elijah stood up. "I found something. About you. About what you did for me." Mr. Bennet smiled gently. "I didn't do it for recognition." "I know," Elijah said. "But I want the world to know." Elijah wasn't the same after that day. He couldn't return to his office, sketch buildings, or talk about budgets while Mr. Bennet wandered the streets. It felt wrong. Hollow. So, first, he contacted the local news station. Then the school board. Then the mayor's office. He shared Mr. Bennet's story, the teacher who had saved lives, shaped minds, and been forgotten. The response was overwhelming. Former students wrote in. Parents remembered his kindness. One woman said Mr. Bennet had taught her son to read when no one else could. Elijah organized a fundraiser. Within 48 hours, it raised over $30,000. He used the money to rent Mr. Bennet a small apartment, buy him clothes, and schedule medical checkups. But Mr. Bennet resisted. "I don't want pity," he said. "It's not pity," Elijah replied. "It's gratitude. And justice." Mr. Bennet finally agreed, on one condition, that Elijah wouldn't stop with him. So Elijah launched a foundation, the Bennet Initiative, to support retired educators facing hardship. He gave interviews, spoke at schools, shared the story again and again. And every time, he ended with the same words. "Kindness isn't charity. It's memory. It's honoring those who built us." They sat. Elijah. Mr. Bennet. "Why didn't you ever reach out?" Elijah finally asked. Mr. Bennet looked ahead, eyes fixed on a group of children playing. "I taught hundreds of students. I watched them grow, succeed, forget. That's the job. But you saved me. And you became someone worth saving." Elijah shook his head. "That's not enough. You deserved more." Mr. Bennet smiled. "I had my time. My purpose was never to be remembered. It was to help others remember themselves." Elijah felt a lump in his throat. "You were the only adult who saw me. Who listened." Mr. Bennet nodded. "That's what teachers do. We listen between the silence." They sat for a long time. Then Mr. Bennet reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this years ago. Never gave it to anyone." Elijah unfolded it. It was a letter, addressed to any student who still remembers. It spoke of hope, of resilience, of the quiet power of kindness. Elijah read it aloud. His voice trembled. "If you ever find me, don't mourn what I've lost. Celebrate what you've become." Tears welled in Elijah's eyes. "I want the world to hear this." Mr. Bennet smiled. "Then read it loud." 1 year later, Elijah stood in his office, staring at a framed letter. It was Mr. Bennet's note, the one he had written. "To any student who still remembers." Beside it hung Elijah's architectural awards, degrees, and a photo of the two of them in the park. The Bennet Initiative had grown. Over 200 retired teachers had received housing, medical care, and emotional support. Schools across the country had begun honoring their educators annually. Mr. Bennet now lived in a quiet apartment near the lake. He taught poetry at a community center twice a week. He never asked for more. Elijah visited often. They talked about books, buildings, and the strange ways life folds back on itself. One afternoon, Mr. Bennet said, "You built something, Elijah. Not just with steel and glass, but with memory." Elijah smiled. "You gave me the blueprint." Before leaving, Elijah placed a new plaque on his office wall. "Kindness is the foundation. Everything else is just design." Outside, the city moved as always, fast, loud, indifferent. But somewhere in its heart, a quiet legacy grew. Not of fame, not of fortune, but of one man who gave his leftovers, and found the man who once gave him everything. Enjoyed this? Hit like, comment your theories, and subscribe for more secret stories the world doesn't talk about. Turn on the bell. The next drop will blow your mind.